Stop what you're doing and go to YouTube. John Oliver on Last Week Tonight has done a segment on the Colorado water situation. I haven't seen it yet, but I can't wait to see what he gets right. And I'm kind of bracing myself to see what he gets wrong.
We're going to focus on the American West, where the last several decades have seen a record-breaking drought. The Southwest is actually going through its driest 22-year period since 800 AD.
So far, so good. He's talking about the historical context of drought and how much water is coming into the basin, the part about this being the worst drought ever. While the provability of that is a little sketchy, for the sake of this conversation, let's just go with it.
It's had massive impact on the Colorado River in particular, which is a key source of water for most of the southwestern states.
22 years of drought combined with exploding populations, Lake Powell in Utah and Lake Mead outside Las Vegas, where an expanding white ring of mineral deposits is probably the most visual evidence of the river's decline. Not sure it's going to get better ever.
Wow. That is a bleak thing to hear an environmental expert say, but then the news here is bleak. Water levels in Lake Mead have now fallen so much that you may have seen authorities have found human remains there twice in just 1 week, which really freaked me out until I remembered that I dumped that hitchhiker in Lake Mojave, not Lake Mead, so I'm good.
Okay, that's a pretty good joke, especially the part about Lake Mojave going to do the research to actually find a different lake on the Colorado. That was a good joke. Honestly, the thing about finding 2 dead bodies in 1 week is the least surprising part of this whole thing. This is a lake that's been filled since the 40s, and it's gone down to a level it's only been at twice since World War II. So it makes sense that you would find stuff you haven't seen in a while, and it's next to Las Vegas.
Surrounding a 20-acre surfing lagoon.
That's right, a 20-acre surfing lagoon in the middle of the California desert. One of at least 4 new surf lagoons proposed out there. That is just monumentally stupid.
Okay, sure, a surfing lagoon sounds wasteful, but honestly, have you seen this? That looks kind of awesome. Oh man, I would definitely try that. Definitely try that. A terrible waste of water, but man, that looks awesome.
How the Colorado River is managed, because a lot of the problems that we're seeing today can be traced back to decisions that were made a century ago.
This precious resource is allocated based on a 1922 agreement called the Colorado River Compact. Once the river basin states agreed on their fair shares, they each established a seniority system. First in time, first in right.
It's true. 7 states got together and carved up.
This is maybe my first small issue with this segment, but honestly, there's probably not an easier way to say it. Basically, this is a gross simplification of how the Colorado River Compact came to be. The 7 states did not come together and agree. Not at all. There was so much bullying that went on, mostly by California. A lot of these states were strong-armed into it. Some tried to hold out and not ratify it until later and then got blackmailed into signing it. It was just a big mess from the start.
A few major problems with how the compact was set up right from the start. First, Mexico wasn't included, and even though it is today, the river essentially runs dry by the time it gets across the border.
This detail about Mexico is true, but it's not nearly this cut and dry. There's actually some very interesting historical context. Here, let me get into that. Okay, the Colorado River starts up here and it goes through all these 7 states, but really the impetus for the Colorado Compact really was this area down here, this area of Southern California called the Imperial Valley. All the way back to 1900, this was the area they wanted irrigated by the river. Despite flowing almost entirely within the United States, it isn't until it crosses the Mexican border that the river is really usable in these flatlands on either side. And so that presented a problem. After all, how do you get water into the United States when it has to go through Mexico first? So early farmers in this region actually kind of just ignored the U.S.-Mexican border and cut several canals on this side that dipped down through Mexico and then crossed the border again to the Imperial Valley. When I say ignored, I mean hydrologically, not politically. They actually had some agreements with the landowners on either side. In fact, there were several haciendas on the Mexican side that owned land in the U.S. and several businesses in America that owned land on the Mexican side. It was actually somewhat mutual. Then politics got in the way. The Mexican government wasn't excited about having the water cross the border without import-export taxes. There were several cases of extortion and raising the leases. It just got really nasty and political, and both sides really escalated the situation. There's a whole fascinating chapter of the story where the Colorado River actually changed course and followed the route of the canal and dried out completely going to the ocean, and all the water went up here to the Imperial Valley, and that's how we got the Salton Sea, but we'll save that for another TikTok. The point is that by the 1920s, this was seen as a national security issue. Mexico was not considered a reliable partner when it came to managing the Colorado River. The U.S. government wanted independence of the river the same way we want energy independence today.
In fact, also didn't specifically address the water needs of the more than 24 Native American tribes who depend on the river, which is pretty shitty, especially as those tribes do have the most senior water rights.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And this doesn't make it right, but the original purpose of the compact was reclamation of new land for new irrigation. It was just kind of assumed that riparian uses would continue because they were so small compared to the new water they wanted to move.
Another key flaw was that right from the start, it allocated more water than actually existed. Water supplies are measured in acre feet, and the compact divided up rights to 15 million acre feet of water, even though the river only carries around 12.
This is not another key flaw. This is the key flaw. Like seriously, everything flows downhill of this one key flaw, pun intended. We now know that the period of time that they originally measured from 1900 to 1920 was maybe the wettest on record. It's never been that wet again, at least not for that sustained amount of time. And to base your projections on that tiny little snapshot was not smart. And we're living with the consequences of that decision today.
They knew this was a problem at the time. The explorer and scientist John Wesley Powell warned in 1893 there is not sufficient water to supply these lands. But the bullshit math never stopped.
Okay, I got to clarify a couple things here because John Wesley Powell was a great man, a great explorer. His legacy is fantastic, but he wasn't perfect, and his myth has been inflated by books like Cadillac Desert. Powell absolutely was prophetic when he said, "Gentlemen, you are piling up a heritage of conflict and litigation over water rights, for there is not sufficient water to supply the land." He was right. He was right, but he was also guessing. Because while he was a great explorer and I believe a geologist and a professor and impressive resume, he was not a hydrologist, and he never did an actual survey of the river. He never measured. He had no way of knowing that. So when he said there isn't enough water, it was more of a hunch. And the fact that his hunch was correct doesn't actually change anything, because in the world that he imagined, where only 2% of the American Southwest would ever be developed, we're talking about many, many cities and urban centers just not existing. It's very easy to cynically look from a distance at cities like Phoenix or Las Vegas or Salt Lake City and say they should never have been built. Just leave them to their own devices. It's easy to say when you don't live there, right? I have a moral issue with that position. It's the exact same wrong-headedness that looked at the victims of Hurricane Katrina and said, "Well, it's your own fault for building a city below sea level." That's not cool. That's not kind. That's not humanitarian. The fact of the matter is, we didn't take Powell's advice and we did develop the American Southwest, which means the question is not should we have, the question is how do we make it sustainable from here on out.
Something's got to give. You can't just keep expanding the population size with a dwindling water supply. That's just not sustainable.
That's just human nature. That really kind of goes back to manifest destiny. It goes back to sort of this American dream. We're going to continue to see people moving to the desert Southwest. So from our perspective as water managers, it is up to us to make sure that we're able to meet the demands of our community, regardless of what our numbers might be.
Okay, so there is a lot there, including the phrase manifest destiny, which, as we all know, only has good connotations. Like a self-published book about my struggle, or I really want to impress Jodie Foster.
Okay, that part about manifest destiny, probably shouldn't have said that, but honestly, engineer guy here, I think he's right. I think he's right. This isn't about whether or not we should, it's how. It's how do we manage what we have to make it sustainable.
The movable fact is, cities in the desert can't grow without limit, and hard sacrifices will have to be made.
Okay, this is where John Oliver and I go different directions, because I disagree with his thesis. This idea that just because you're in the desert, you can't grow, is obviously nonsense. And honestly, a little bit geographically biased. When you're living in a well-established city that's been there for hundreds of years and has a ton of infrastructure that you don't understand, it's easy to just assume that your city is there for time immemorial and everyone else's city is some sort of upstart that doesn't belong here. I just gotta say, there's been a whole lot of you guys who have been in my comments making snarky comments about, well, I guess that's what happens when you build in the desert. Yeah, we build a lot of things in the desert and grow things and make things. the desert's awesome. There's nothing inherently disqualifying to human habitation in the desert, right? You just trade off one set of disadvantages for another. There's things you don't have to worry about in Arizona and Utah that you do have to worry about in, say, the Gulf Coast or, Georgia or South Carolina. If we're going to look at this issue through the lens of fairness, through the lens of equity, I think it's very important right at this top that we don't look down on these regions that are built in different climate zones or different geology than what maybe you're used to.
Which brings us to another fundamental tension here, specifically between farmers and cities. Because farmers and ranchers were out west much earlier than most American cities were established, meaning they have senior water rights, and they use them. Agriculture uses about 70% of the Colorado River water. And look, obviously, agriculture needs water, and no one wants a situation where we create food shortages.
Okay, that part right there, that part, talking about agriculture versus city use, makes me want to give his writing staff a giant high five. Because there was an opportunity here for this to go off the rails, and they didn't do it. They stayed sane. It is so easy to reduce this conversation about Colorado River water down to just drinking water versus farmer water, big ag versus poor people. Like, it's an oversimplification, and it's an incorrect framing of the issue. Truth is, the Colorado River Compact and all of the water projects were built for farms. They were built for agriculture, not drinking water, although some use it for that, like, Southern California. But this whole thing was always about irrigation. So this number right here, 70%, I need to fact check that. It might actually be more than that. That is true, and it shouldn't surprise us. It's actually a feature, not a bug.
It's worth knowing, in some places, farmers are incentivized to use their allocation to a truly nonsensical degree. Many states along the river have rules promising to confiscate water rights if water users don't maximize their use. Basically, use it
or lose it water rights. That is a true thing. It's actually very, very common. You see that in irrigation districts all the time. We have them in central Washington, where I originally grew up. It's not that uncommon. This way of allocating water makes a lot more sense when you are all in the same valley, all sharing the same river, and you have a vested interest in seeing the water be put to the best use. And if Farmer Brown over here isn't really using his allocation, well, maybe Farmer Ben over there could do a better job. Like, it makes sense. After all, in that scenario, it really wasn't lost. It maybe went to your neighbor, but it's still in the valley, it's still there, and you could potentially get it back if you found a better use for it. The problem with the Colorado Compact is that it pits entire states against each other. These use or lose it allocations are not about individual parcels of land. This is about an entire state's percentage of the river. Use or lose it on a massive scale.
The Colorado River is shrinking. But what that is leading to now is water users increasingly turning to another major water source, groundwater. Now, groundwater is exactly what it sounds like. Water under the ground. It slowly collects in aquifers beneath the Earth's surface, accumulating when rain, snowmelt, and other natural water sources seep into the ground. But importantly, some of these aquifers took thousands, if not millions, of years to fill. So if we pump them dry, they're not coming back anytime soon. But that's not always reflected in our policies. Take Arizona, for instance. In 80% of the state, there are no laws protecting how much water is taken from the ground.
Okay, this is tricky because the segment on groundwater is mostly fact-based, but the framing of it is just a little off. Aquifers are highly regional. It varies from state to state, geology to geology. Basically, no two aquifers are alike. And so most of these laws have emerged in situations where they've really needed to manage the water because of shortages or overuse. And so in a place like northern Arizona, they just haven't gotten there yet. And frankly, may not be much of an issue because the amount of water that you could pull out of the ground with wells is infinitesimal compared to what is moved with the large water projects and the Colorado River system. So, apples to oranges, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
It's not just Arizona. Big farming operations have long been pumping groundwater in the San Joaquin Valley in California, and it has had some pretty severe consequences.
Okay, I take issue to this editorial decision here. These two regions have nothing to do with each other. The groundwater issue in the San Joaquin Valley has nothing to do with the Colorado River water or the state of Arizona or any of those issues. Even the geology is different. It's not the same thing.
Much water is pumped out of the aquifer below ground, the clay between the pockets of water collapses, and the ground starts to deflate like a leaky air mattress. The sinking is buckling the walls of irrigation canals, damaging pipes.
Okay, the story of the loss of groundwater in the San Joaquin Valley is very real and very tragic for the people living there. but it's not really representative of what's happening in Arizona. For one thing, it's all about the geology of the Central Valley. It's also a completely different set of water rights mismanagement in the Central Valley of California that has caused the groundwater to be overutilized. So complaining about wells in Arizona and then pointing to San Joaquin Valley, not exactly an appropriate comparison.
So responding to this crisis, places have gone in very different directions. One of the best actors, and you are not going to believe this, is actually Las Vegas, which I know automatically feels weird because when you think of Vegas, things like this.
How you doing?
All right, so he goes on to explain that Las Vegas's water features actually aren't all that wasteful. They've got really good recycling, just it isn't a major bear on the system. I said this in a previous video, and most of y'all didn't believe me. It's not the water that you use once that causes this crisis. It's the water you use over and over again. So things like fountains and swimming pools, not a problem. Golf courses, big problem.
At least a dozen golf courses, including these. And golf courses use a shit ton of water. They are pretty much the dumbest possible thing to put into the middle of the desert, other than, of course, Burning Man. And while Utah has...
It's true. He's got a point. Golf courses and artificial lawns, those two things, those two luxury items, if we got rid of them, would single-handedly solve the water crisis in the entire Southwest, including Southern California. That's it. Just lawns and golf courses.
States can continue using water the way they've gotten used to. Experts suggest it might help actually not to use the word drought at all anymore, which sounds temporary, and instead use the term aridification as a better way to describe what might be a long-term drying.
This is an interesting point. The term drought may be obsolete here, and the term mega drought is not particularly helpful. Eridification, less water overall over time. There's some utility to that, and I like big words, so I like where this is going. But I do put a soft challenge on this idea that the current eridification is permanent. We don't have a crystal ball. We don't know the future. We don't know if this is here to stay or not. We should plan like it is, but we don't actually know that. Go back and watch my video on the history of flows into the Colorado River. You'll see that it's gone up and down all the time, with some trends up, some trends down, and right now we are in a trend down. But we are not dramatically outside the norms of what we typically see. At Lake Powell and Lake Mead, you would think the Colorado River's flow had been cut in half or more than that, like the water's drying up. And it's just not, right? It's drought, but it's only down single-digit % from the 100-year average. Like everything with these water rights, it's all in how you frame the numbers, and I understand that I'm framing my numbers in a more optimistic way, and you might have a different perspective, and that's okay. But hopefully we can all agree, we don't have a time machine. We don't know what's coming in the future. Don't forget, Yellowstone National Park and that upper area of the Yellowstone River got record precipitation just a few weeks ago. And we've kind of already forgotten that, right? Weather's crazy and hard to predict.
Arizona passed a resolution to study building a pipeline from the Mississippi River to the Colorado River. And if you've ever seen a map of the United States, you may have noticed that the Mississippi River is all the way over here and Arizona is all the way over here. To do that, you need a pipeline that's over 1,000 miles long.
Okay, I'm not suggesting that we break ground tomorrow on a 1,000-mile canal from the Mississippi to the Colorado River. But I am saying there's got to be some engineers out there who are saying, hold my beer, when this is suggested. Crazier things have been proposed, right? Things almost this crazy and ambitious have been accomplished. 150 years ago, it was crazy to think that they could connect the oceans via the Panama Canal. And now it's done. The Colorado River system, the Columbia River system, all impossible at the time. While this particularly absurd route is not what I would recommend, never say never when it comes to ambitious civil engineering projects. This is just the kind of stuff that my channel loves. So yeah, I liked it. I'd say 8 out of 10 stars. A flawed but fair analysis and explainer of the situation in the American Southwest. This program, I thought, did a good job of summarizing it, making it easy to understand, and didn't fall into the major ditches on either side of the road that so many explainer videos have fallen into. They didn't fall into the trap of bashing our dams. The storage infrastructure that has lessened the impacts of the drought over the last 20 years is oftentimes a scapegoat during these times. And John Oliver never went there. What do you guys want to talk about? What do you want to learn about? I would love to unpack this more, go into more of the history and how we got to where we are today, as well as solutions for the future.